At 74 years old, Harold Brennan lay down for an afternoon nap in the only house he had ever owned, and woke to the sound of a stranger's voice in his living room saying, "We'll knock out this wall here." A young woman in a blazer was holding a tape measure against the plaster Harold had hung himself in the spring of 1969. She did not look at him when he came down the hall in his slippers. Neither did his 3 children, standing by the window with a folder of papers already signed. The house was sold. They had done it while he slept. 8 years he had lived inside those walls. He carried his bride across that threshold. He buried that same wife from the front room, her casket angled through the door he had widened with his own saw so it would fit. Down in the basement was the workshop that had fed all 3 of his children, paid for their braces, their weddings, their first cars, all of it, the walls, the workshop, the life sold for a check none of them had ever planned to share with him. But in their hurry to have him gone by Friday, they forgot one thing. They never went down to the basement. Harold Brennan was 74 years old, and every morning of his life began the same way. At 6:10, before the coffee, he went down the 14 wooden stairs into the basement and pulled the brass chain on the workshop light. The chain was original. He had screwed the fixture into the joist himself in 1968, the same year he and Eleanor bought the house at 14 Maple Hollow Road. And in 58 years, that pull chain had never once failed to bring the light up over his workbench. He liked to stand a moment in that light before anyone else was awake. Then he went up and made the coffee. He was a carpenter, not a hobbyist, a craftsman who had spent 4 decades building custom furniture under a hand-painted sign that used to hang over the garage, Brennan Carpentry, EST. 1968, people still drove in from 3 counties for a Brennan dining table. His hands shook a little now in the mornings, but put a chisel in them and the shaking stopped. That was the thing about Harold most people missed. He looked frail until he started working. His world was small, and he loved every inch of it. The kitchen where Eleanor's apron still hung on the hook by the stove. 4 years after the cancer took her. The front room where he kept her reading chair exactly where it had been. The maple tree out front that he'd planted the week their first son, Derek, was born. He kept a routine the way other men kept their faith. Coffee at 6:30. The newspaper. A walk to the mailbox, though the real mail, the business mail, went to a P.O. box across town that only he ever checked. There was a young woman who came 3 days a week now. Maria, the children had hired her after Harold's fall on the ice last winter to keep an eye on things. She was quiet, careful, and she had a way of noticing when his hands were bothering him without making him say so. She would sit on the basement stairs sometimes and watch him sand a tabletop and ask real questions about the grain of the wood. Harold's own children had never once asked about the grain of the wood. His children came less and less. Derek, the eldest, an architect in the city, came mostly to talk about your situation, Dad, and what makes sense going forward. His daughter Sharon came with brochures for places with names like Maplewood Gardens and Serenity Pines. The youngest, Kevin, came when he needed money and left when he got it. The warning sign came in March. Harold was at the kitchen table when he heard Derek on the porch, voice low into his phone, say the word appraisal. Harold set down his coffee. When Derek came in, he said the man outside had been a county surveyor. Routine, nothing to worry about. Harold nodded and let it go. He had raised these children. He had taught Derek to drive in the church parking lot. A man does not assume the worst of his own son, but that night, out of an old habit he could not have explained, Harold went down to the basement, pulled the brass chain, and opened the bottom drawer of his tool cabinet just to make sure a certain thing was still where Eleanor had put it. It was. He slid the drawer shut, turned off the light, and went up to bed. The closing was on a Thursday. Harold did not know it was a closing. He knew only that on Tuesday, April 14th, Sharon arrived with a casserole and a thick blue folder, and that she kept the folder in her lap through the whole meal, both hands on top of it, like it might fly away, that after the plates were cleared, Derek arrived. Then Kevin. All three of his children in the kitchen on a weeknight. It had not happened since Eleanor's funeral. Harold felt something cold settle in his chest and ignored it, because that is what fathers do. Derek did the talking. He always did. He slid a single sheet across the table and put a pen on top of it. Dad, this just makes everything simpler. It's a power of attorney. So we can help you handle things, bills, the house, all of it. So you don't have to worry. Harold looked at the page. The print was small, and the words ran together the way small print did now. He asked if he could read it tomorrow, when the light was better. Derek said the notary was only available tonight. Sharon put her hand over his hand. Kevin looked at his phone. Harold signed where his son pointed. He trusted the boy he taught to drive. He did not know that the page beneath the page he signed was not a power of attorney. He did not know that on Thursday morning, while he napped in the front room with the newspaper over his chest, Derek would carry that signature to a title company across town and transfer the house at 14 Maple Hollow Road to a buyer for $340,000, a buyer Derek had lined up 6 weeks earlier. Harold found out the way you find out a thing you were never meant to find out. He woke from the nap to a stranger's voice, measuring his living room for a wall that wasn't going to be there much longer. He fought. God knows he fought. He got Derek by the elbow in the hall and said, "You will tell me what you've done." He drove himself to a lawyer the next morning, hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2. And laid the one paper he had his copy of the power of attorney on the desk of a man named Phillips, who read it twice, took off his glasses, and told Harold the hardest thing a man can hear. That the signature was real, that without proof the sale was improper, there was very little to be done, that these cases, son against father, almost never went anywhere. Harold drove home, and the for sale sign in his own yard already had a red sold banner stapled across it. The children moved fast after that. They had to. Sharon told him the new owners want possession by Friday, and that they'd found him a lovely room at Maplewood Gardens, deposit already paid, his name already on the door. Kevin packed Harold's clothes into 2 suitcases. Derek arranged for a truck. On Wednesday morning, the cast-out came. It was not a speech. It was Kevin carrying the second suitcase down the porch steps and setting it on the driveway next to the first, then folding open a metal chair from the garage and saying, "You can wait here, Dad. The van comes at 11. Then the three of them went back inside Harold's house and shut Harold's door. And Harold Brennan sat down on a folding chair in his own driveway in the sunshine with 2 suitcases and his hat in his lap and waited. That is where he was sitting when the basement door banged open. The new buyers had sent their contractor early to start gutting the place, and the man came up out of the basement and out the side door too fast. The way a man moves when he's found something he wasn't ready for. He crossed the lawn to the folding chair. He was holding an envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, and it had been taped, by the dried look of the tape, under something for a very long time. On the front, in handwriting Harold would have known in the dark, in the handwriting that had signed his birthday cards and his anniversary cards for 46 years, were 8 words, to be opened only by the one who still turns on this light. The contractor said, "Lo, just a Harold. Found it taped under the workbench. Figured it was yours." Then he went back inside. Harold's hands were shaking. They were shaking the way they shook in the mornings, the bad shake, the one that stopped only when he was working. He turned the envelope over, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet folded once. In Eleanor's hand, Harold the house was never theirs to sell. Check the cabinet. E. Inside the house, through the open window, he could hear his children laughing about something. Harold folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket over his heart, and looked up at the house his children had just stolen, and for the first time in 3 days, his hands went still. The van from Maplewood Gardens came at 11, just as Kevin had promised. A cheerful aide in scrubs hopped down and reached for the suitcases. Harold did not get up. He sat in the folding chair with Eleanor's note in his pocket and said, in a voice that surprised everyone, including himself, "There's been a change. I won't be needing the room." The aide looked at the house, looked at the 2 suitcases, looked at the old man in the chair, and made a phone call. Inside, a curtain moved. Harold did not look at it. He picked up 1 suitcase, left the other, and walked not to the house, which he could no longer enter, but down Maple Hollow Road toward town, because a man with a destination cannot be a man who has been thrown away. And Harold had decided, somewhere between the envelope and the van, that he had a destination. The destination was Maria's. She lived in a converted garage apartment behind her aunt's house on the east side, 4 rooms and a hot plate. And when she opened the door and found Harold Brennan standing there with a single suitcase and a folded note, she did not ask the questions most people would have asked. She made him sit down. She made him tea. And when he laid the note on her little kitchen table and told her what it said about the cabinet, Maria did the thing that made all the difference. She believed him. She had sat on those basement stairs for 8 months. She had watched his hands stop shaking when he worked. She knew exactly which man the town thought Harold was, and she knew it was wrong. The cabinet's in the basement, she said. And the basement isn't yours anymore. She was quiet a moment. But I still have a key. They never asked for it back. That was the first trial, getting back into the house he had built to retrieve the thing that would prove they had stolen it. They did not break in. Harold would not hear of it. Instead, Maria called the contractor the same man who had handed Harold the envelope, and the contractor, who had a father of his own and a low opinion of children who sold houses out from under sleeping men, agreed to let them in for 20 minutes to collect personal tools the family forgot. It was technically true. On Thursday at dusk, Harold walked down his own 14 basement stairs one more time. He pulled the brass chain. The light came up over the bench exactly as it had for 58 years. And then he knelt at the tool cabinet, removed the false back panel he had built into it with his own hands in 1991, and lifted out a gray fireproof lockbox the size of a bread box. He did not open it there. There wasn't time. He carried it up the stairs, past the contractor, out to Maria's car, and they drove away from 14 Maple Hollow Road with the one thing in the world Derek, Sharon, and Kevin had never once thought to look for. They opened it on Maria's kitchen table at 9 that night. The first thing was a deed, not the deed Derek had used. The original instrument from 1968, and clipped to it a second document with a notary's embossed seal, a declaration of trust. Harold read it twice. Then he set it down and put his hand flat on it, like a man steadying himself. The house at 14 Maple Hollow Road had not been owned by Harold Brennan, the person. It had been placed, the year they bought it, into the Brennan Family Trust and Irrevocable Trust, with terms that Harold, as trustee, could not unilaterally sell, and that no one holding a power of attorney over Harold the man could sell either, because Harold the man had never owned it to begin with. Derek had transferred a house his father did not legally hold the power to convey. The sale wasn't just cruel, it was void. The second thing in the box was a single page in Eleanor's hand, notarized 11 days before she died, a codicil. It named the basement workshop and every tool, account, and contract belonging to it as her separate property and directed that it pass, on Harold's passing, not by blood, but to whoever cares for Harold in his final years. Maria read that line and stood up and went to the sink and ran the water for a while and did not turn around. The third thing was a rubber banded brick of paper, 40 years of commission receipts, and underneath them, bank statements, recent ones, mailed to the P.O. Box only Harold checked for a business account in the name of Brennan Carpentry. Sole signatory Harold Brennan. Current balance $211,000. Harold looked at the number a long time. Then he looked at Maria. "I'm not poor," he said, as if discovering it. "They told everyone I was a burden. I'm not poor, and I'm not finished." The next morning, he started building again. There was no workshop now, so he made one. Maria's aunt had a dry, unused barn at the back of the property, and Harold paid her $400 a month for it from an account his children did not know existed, and he had his tools delivered from the basement, the contractor again, loading a truck under the legal pretext that the seller's possessions had to be removed anyway. By the end of the first week, there was a bench, a lathe, and a single light bulb on a pull chain that Harold installed first. Before anything else, because some habits are older than grief, the town noticed. The town talked. In a place the size of theirs, the story had already calcified into something simple and wrong. Old man Brennan had lost his marbles, sold his own house, and now the poor confused soul was holed up in a barn pretending to be a carpenter again. And wasn't it a shame? And weren't his children doing the best they could? At the hardware store, the man behind the counter spoke to Harold slowly and loudly, the way people speak to the very old, and rang up his order with a pitying look. Harold paid in cash, counted his change, and said nothing. He had a deed in a lockbox. He could afford to let them be wrong for a little while longer. Then the adversary escalated. Derek was not a stupid man, and a stupid man's plan would not have gotten this far. When word reached him that his father was not at Maplewood Gardens, was not settling in, but was instead in a barn with his tools and a lawyer's appointment, Derek understood that the only thing standing between him and a transferred $340. 000 was the question of whether Harold Brennan was competent, and so he moved to make sure the answer, on paper, was no. He filed a petition for guardianship. He attached a physician's letter obtained from a doctor who had seen Harold for 15 minutes after the ice fall in winter, stating concerns about cognitive decline. And he filed alongside it the transfer documents themselves, the ones bearing Harold's signature. The papers were served to Harold in the barn by a process server who looked around at the sawdust and the half-built sideboard on the bench and clearly felt he was witnessing the last sad days of a man who didn't know better. Maria read the petition out loud at the kitchen table. If Derek won, Harold would be declared incapacitated. A guardian Derek would control his money, his decisions, his life, and a man declared incompetent could not very well stand up in a courtroom and claim a trust had been violated, because his word would be worth nothing. It was the smartest thing Derek ever did, and it was the thing that destroyed him. Because to argue his father was too far gone to manage his own affairs, Derek had to put it in writing. And the moment he put it in writing, Harold reached into the bottom of the lockbox and took out the last thing in it, the thing that was not a document at all. It was a digital voice recorder. Cheap. Black. the kind sold in a blister pack at a pharmacy. Harold's grandson, Kevin's boy, had given it to him 2 birthdays ago, so Grandpa can save your stories. Harold had used it for exactly that, and out of an old craftsman's instinct to keep a record of every job, every conversation, every handshake deal, he had kept it running in his shirt pocket through the months his children circled him. He had not even thought of it as a weapon. He had thought of it as a habit. Maria took the recorder to the lawyer, Mr. Okafor, the trust attorney whose name was printed on the 1968 Declaration, and who, astonishingly, was still practicing 2 doors down from the courthouse, gray now and slow to rise from his chair, but sharp as a finish nail. Okafor listened to the recordings for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he played one section again. It was Derek's voice, in Harold's own kitchen, weeks before the sale, saying to Sharon, "Relax. He won't even notice. He sleeps half the day, and once it's signed, there's nothing he can do anyway." Okafor set down the recorder. He looked at Harold, and the old lawyer smiled for the first time in the meeting. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "your son has filed a sworn petition claiming you are not competent to manage your affairs, and he has handed us, in the same week, a recording of himself stating that you would not notice a fraud being committed against you." He folded his hands. "He has told the court 2 things that cannot both be true. One of them is going to convict him." For the first time since he woke to a stranger's tape measure, Harold Brennan laughed. The sideboard on the bench got finished. That was the first thing. Whatever was coming in the courtroom, Harold rose at 6:10 every morning, walked the length of the barn, pulled the chain, and worked. Because a job left half done in the vise was an offense against everything Eleanor had married. He fitted the last drawer, rubbed the top with oil until the maple went deep and warm, and stood it up against the barn wall where the morning light could reach it. Maria photographed it on her phone and, without telling him, posted the picture to the county's online marketplace with 3 words: Brennan Carpentry. Available. It sold in 9 hours. The buyer, a woman from 2 towns over, drove out to the barn to collect it and stood looking at the piece for a long moment before she paid. "My mother had a Brennan table," she said. "Everyone said you'd retired." Harold told her he had unretired. She paid him in full and asked if he took commissions. By the end of the month, there were 4. That was how the town began to turn, not with a headline, but with a sideboard in a stranger's dining room, and then another in someone's foyer, and then the slow spread of a thing people in small towns trust more than any newspaper: a piece of furniture you can put your hand on. The same man at the hardware store who had spoken to Harold slowly and loudly now rang up his order at a normal volume and, one Tuesday, said quietly, "Heard you're taking work again." "That's good. That's real good." Harold counted his change and said it was, but the rise was not only in the barn, it was in Mr. Okafor's office, where the case was being built the way Harold built a cabinet joint by joint, square and tight, nothing forced. Okafor filed first to dismiss the guardianship petition, attaching the business bank statements, a $211,000 account, sole signatory Harold Brennan, with deposits and signed checks dated through the very weeks Derek claimed his father couldn't manage a checkbook. He attached the 4 new commission contracts, each in Harold's steady hand. He attached a fresh evaluation from a geriatric specialist in the city. Maria had driven Harold there herself, finding no cognitive impairment whatsoever. "A man does not run a profitable business," the report noted dryly, while being incapable of understanding one, and he had not yet played the recording for the court. Okafor was holding it. "We don't fire our heaviest charge to win a skirmish," he told Harold. We dismissed the guardianship with the bank records. We saved the recording for the thing that matters, the sale itself, and what your son did to push it through. Harold understood. He had spent his life knowing which tool to reach for, and when, then came the deed. Okafor pulled the chain of title on 14 Maple Hollow Road and laid the original 1968 trust instrument beside the transfer Derek had filed. The difference was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation. The property had been held by the Brennan Family Trust for 58 years. No power of attorney over Harold, the individual, could touch it. Because Harold, the individual, had never held title. The buyer's title was built on sand. Okafor sent formal notice to the buyer's attorney with the trust attached. The buyer, a level-headed man who had paid $340,000 in good faith, did exactly what a level-headed man does when shown that the house he bought was never the seller's to sell. He stopped. He halted the renovation, contacted his title insurance company, and demanded his money back from the people who had taken it, which is to say, from Derek, Sharon, and Kevin, who had already divided and spent a meaningful portion of $340,000 that now had to be returned to a man whose house they could not legally deliver. Still, Derek did not fold. This is the part that must be understood, because it is what made what came next inevitable. Derek had the physician's letter from the winter. He had a lawyer of his own. He believed even now that with enough paper and enough confidence, he could reframe the whole thing: a confused old man, a well-meaning family, a misunderstanding about a trust nobody remembered. He scheduled a meeting. He called it a family meeting. He told Sharon and Kevin it was to get everyone on the same page before this gets out of hand, and he chose the venue deliberately. Mr. Phillips's office downtown, the first lawyer Harold had gone to, the one who had told Harold there was nothing to be done. Derek wanted the meeting on ground where his father had already once been told he had no case. He invited Harold. He expected a frightened old man and a hired aide. Harold accepted the invitation. Then he called Maria, and Maria called Mr. Okafor, and the three of them sat at the barn workbench under the single pull chain bulb and decided exactly what would walk through that door and in what order. The night before the meeting, Harold finished the cradle. It was small and curved, and the wood was the off-cut maple from the sideboard, and he had not told anyone what it was for or who it was for, though Maria had begun, in the last few weeks, to rest her hand against her stomach when she thought no one was looking, and Harold missed very little. He sanded the rockers until they were silk. He set it on the bench beside the lockbox. Then he turned off the light, and for the first time in his life, he was eager for the morning to come. They were already seated when Harold arrived, Derek at the head of the conference table, Sharon and Kevin flanking him, Mr. Phillips's young associate at the end with a legal pad. Derek had dressed for it. He stood, pulled out a chair, and said, "Dad, thank you for coming. Sit down, we'll get you sorted out." The voice was the same voice that had slid a pen across a kitchen table. Harold did not sit. "I'll stand a while," he said. "My legs are fine." There seems to be some confusion about that. The door opened behind him. Maria came in first. Then a gray man with a cane and a leather folder, who lowered himself into a chair with great dignity and set the folder on the table. Derek's associate looked up. "And you are?" "Samuel Okafor," the old lawyer said. "I drafted the Brennan Family Trust in 1968. I'm here on behalf of the trustee." He opened the folder. "Which is to say, on behalf of the house." What happened next did not take long. Okafor was a man who, like Harold, did not waste material. He laid the trust instrument on the table first and walked them through it in plain words. The house at 14 Maple Hollow Road had been held by an irrevocable trust for 58 years. Harold had never personally owned it. The power of attorney Derek obtained was a power over Harold the man, and Harold the man had no power to sell what the trust held. The sale, Okafor said, is void, not voidable. Void, the buyer has already been notified. He will be made whole by the three of you. Sharon's hand went to her mouth. Kevin began. We didn't know about any, and Derek cut him off with a look. Okafor laid down the second document. The bank statements. The court has also received your petition, Derek, claiming your father lacks the capacity to manage his affairs. He turned the statements so they faced Derek, sole signatory. $211,000. Active deposits and signed checks throughout the exact period you describe him as incompetent, plus a clean geriatric evaluation dated last month. He let it sit. You cannot tell a court your father is too impaired to sign a check, and in the same filing, ask it to honor a sale you say he authorized. You have sworn to two contradictory things. A judge is going to ask which lie you'd like to keep. Derek's confidence held barely because Derek still believed it was his word against an old man's. This is a misunderstanding, he said. Dad was struggling. We were trying to protect him. There's a physician's letter. Harold reached into his coat pocket and set the recorder on the table. He did not say anything. He pressed the button. And into the silence of Mr. Phillips's conference room came Derek's own voice, recorded in Harold's own kitchen, weeks before the sale. Relax. He won't even notice. He sleeps half the day, and once it's signed, there's nothing he can do anyway. The recording clicked off. Nobody moved. Sharon had gone white. Kevin was looking at his brother, the way a man looks at a thing he has just understood the cost of. Derek opened his mouth and found there was nothing on the page in front of him to read from. Okafor folded his hands. You forged the nature of a document your father trusted you enough to sign unread. You transferred property held in trust. You swore your father incompetent to seize what you'd taken. And you recorded yourself describing the plan. He looked almost gently at the young associate at the end of the table who had stopped writing. I'd advise your client to retain criminal counsel. This office should not be representing all three of them. Their interests are no longer the same. That, more than anything, was the sound of the power collapsing the associate, quietly closing his pad and sliding his chair back an inch, separating himself from the table. Then, Harold spoke, and the room turned to him, because it was, in the end, his to decide. He looked at his three children one at a time. He did not raise his voice. Your mother left a note, he said. It said the house was never yours to sell. She knew. 11 days before she died, she sat at our kitchen table and made sure that whatever was in me, whatever was in that workshop, would go to whoever cared for me at the end. He let his eyes rest on Maria, then come back, not by blood, her words, by who showed up. He picked up the recorder and put it back in his pocket, over his heart, the way he had carried Eleanor's note out of the driveway. I am taking back my house. I am pressing every charge Mr. Okafor tells me I can press. You will return every dollar to the man you cheated, and you will answer for the rest in front of a judge. He paused, and for one moment the father in him surfaced, and it was worse than anger. I taught you to drive. I paid for your weddings out of that workshop you never once walked down into. I would have given you all of it, freely, if you had only waited for me to die instead of trying to bury me while I slept. He picked up his hat from the table. You will not be hearing from me again. You'll be hearing from him. and Harold Brennan walked out of the office, past the lawyer who had once told him there was nothing to be done, and did not look back to see his children's faces. He had a cradle to finish. The buyers backed out completely, and their title company, eager to be free of the whole ruined business, sold the house back into the Brennan Family Trust for far less than it had been stolen for. On a morning in early autumn, Harold Brennan walked up the porch steps of 14 Maple Hollow Road, fitted his own key into his own door, and went inside. Eleanor's apron was gone. The children had cleared the kitchen, but he had kept it in the suitcase he never unpacked at Maria's, and he hung it back on the hook by the stove where it had been for 30 years. Then he framed the 1968 deed and hung it in the front hall, where the light from the door fell on it in the afternoons. Beside the front door, mounted into the brick, was a new brass plaque. Harold had cast the lettering himself and polished it by hand. Brennan and Daughter Restoration Carpentry, EST, 1968/reopened 2026. The daughter on the sign was Maria. The adoption had gone through in August, signed by a judge who had read the whole file and shaken Harold's hand afterward, which judges are not supposed to do. She had her own key now. She did not need to keep one in secret. The workshop ran again. Commissions came faster than one man could fill them, so Maria learned the bench beside him, the grain of the wood, the set of a chisel, the patience of finished demands, and her questions. The same real questions she had asked from the basement stairs 2 years before were now the questions of an apprentice and not a stranger. The town drove out for a Brennan piece the way it always had, and no one spoke to Harold slowly or loudly anymore. Derek pled to the forgery and the fraud. Sharon and Kevin returned what they could and stayed away. Harold did not soften, and he did not gloat. He simply stopped having room in his days for them, because his days were full of better things. In the late autumn, Maria's child was born a girl, and Harold carried the cradle up from the workshop himself, the maple curved in silk and made from the offcut of the very first piece he'd built in the barn. He set it in the front room, beside Eleanor's reading chair, which had never moved. And every morning still, at 6:10, before the coffee, before anyone else was awake, Harold Brennan went down the 14 wooden stairs into the basement of the house they could not take from him, and reached up in the dark and pulled the brass chain his own hand had hung. In 1968, but the light still worked.